Thank you for letting us come talk to you.
No, glad to do it.
I'm sure you saw that President Trump already has fired back about your book. He told the Wall Street Journal you are a liar who everybody in the White House hated. And he told Fox News that you were a washed up guy who broke the law. What do you say in response to President Trump?
You know, whoever hired Bolton should get fired. I mean, I explain in the book several conversations I'd had with the president before he offered me the job, with and without other people in the room. As he told me frequently, he watched Fox News all the time. That became clear certainly after I went to work at the White House. He saw me. I've been accused of a lot of things over the course of my career. I've never been accused of hiding my views. So I think he knew what he was getting. Certainly he could have and did, I know, call a lot of people. You know, ultimately, a test of leadership, whether you're president or running a small business, is you're willing to own the decisions you make. And that was his decision.
He made the decision to hire you. You made the decision to go work for him, having, as you talk about in your book, having had many discussions with him. Did you know what you were getting in for?
Well, I certainly think I knew part of what I was getting in for. And I knew of many of the criticisms that had been made of the president, certainly within the Republican Party. The never-Trumpers were a very well-known group. Many of them were my friends. I hope it's not in the plural entirely. But I believed, based on my dealings with him and just based on faith in the institution and the presidency, that it could be made to work, and that there were many threats and challenges facing the United States. It's always an honor to serve the country, and I was perhaps more optimistic than I should have been. People sometimes ask me, well, knowing everything that you know now, would you have made the same decision? And I can't honestly answer that question. Obviously, I could do some things differently once I got there. Maybe that would have made the relationship more productive. But I think that the main point now is I've had the benefit of watching Donald Trump in action. And I think, especially in the context of an election year, the American people can read the book. They will see a lot of facts. And the book has opinions and arguments in it. That's true. All books do. But I didn't write it for my opinions. I wrote it for the facts I could describe. And people can read it, and they can draw their own conclusions. I'm worried that with the 2020 election out of the way, if Trump is reelected, that at that point there's no electoral constraint on him any further. And I think it's entirely possible that conservatives and Republicans will be very surprised about what a second Trump term looks like. So they can read these stories, they can read the material I lay out, which, as the president has said on different occasions, is either all lies or all classified. I suppose we could ask to declassify the lies. I'm not sure how that works. But people can read the book and they can make up their own mind.
You talk about you're interested in making sure people think about what a second Trump term would look like. What would a second Trump term look like, do you think?
I don't think we can have any idea. What I saw in 17 months was a president who's doesn't base his actions on philosophy, doesn't have grand strategy, doesn't follow consistent policies. It's like a continuing random walk. The theme that emerges, I think, through his actions, though, is a total focus on re-election, and the feeling that he can't do something, as he said in the case of the Korea negotiations, that would make him look foolish with the Republican Party. Once he doesn't have to worry about Republican Party support in elections anymore, and people start talking to him about his legacy, this is a word that can have an effect on people. Democrats might be very surprised at what a second Trump term would look like, and Republicans might be even more surprised. But it's not because it would be unified on the basis of philosophy, but on the opportunistic view of how Donald Trump looks.
You portray him, you know, The president and the Justice Department talk about classified material that they say is in the book, but the actual most damaging material in the book isn't anything that might conceivably be classified. It's the portrayal of the president. You portray him as being uninformed, incurious, erratic, naive. Do you think naive is a word that fits Donald Trump?
No, I think he has a certain low cunning, that he's got astute political antenna. There's no question about that. That's really my point. This is, by definition, anybody who gets elected president is successful politically. But that doesn't lead to any conclusion about what governance looks like. It's every president takes political factors into account, and there's no dispute about that, and it's perfectly legitimate. The issue is whether essentially the only factors you take into account are your own image, your own portrayal, your own electoral future.
You've seen a lot of presidents up close. You've worked in the past four Republican administrations. Is Donald Trump fit to be president?
No, I don't think he's competent to be president. I think that he's almost proud of not learning much about the subject matter of national security, certainly. I think that his political instincts are all about Donald Trump. And I think that leads to a very divisive kind of environment. And I think his communications have helped continue to degrade the political society that we have here, which was already under pressure. This didn't start with the Trump administration. But I think he has made it worse. And to go back to the statements that he made about me that you began with, you know, that's how you talk in alley talk, locker room talk. And yet here we have the President of the United States. In this case, it happens to be attacking me. It could be you tomorrow. It could be anybody the next day. And we've become so immune to it that people say, well, there he goes again. This is not good for civil society in the United States. And if Trump is defeated in November, the problem won't go away. But he has certainly, I think, made it much worse.
You've gotten headlines because this is a portrayal from someone in a very senior job who worked for Trump, giving us this picture. Do other senior officials in the White House and the cabinet who have not spoken up agree with you?
Yes, I think they do, and I talk about some of these episodes in the book. I don't mean to do that in a critical way. I had to make some very difficult decisions when I resigned. I thought about it several times. I go through some of these scenarios in the book. And there are many who are already outside the government as well. I know they went through the same thing. I think many who are still in the administration are going through it on a daily basis. And there are a lot of factors to consider. But the uniformity of the view, with the exception of a very small group around the president, of how unsatisfactory his administration is really striking. And this is something that, not a question of personal loyalty. I think when you're honored to serve in a senior position, your loyalty is to the Constitution and the American people. In my case, I've been in politics since I was a teenager, working for Barry Goldwater's election. And well, I've tried to be guided by philosophy. I've gotten praise from some people. I've gotten my share of criticism. Some would say more than my share of criticism. But to me, the lodestar here is philosophy. And the thing that perhaps worries me most about the Trump administration is that there's no philosophy at all. There are decisions that I agree with, that this person can agree with, that person can agree with. But despite the efforts of some outside commentators, as I say in the book, on a daily basis, it's like living inside a pinball machine.
Well, in fact, the picture that you get of the task, you had clear policy ideas that you wanted to pursue. You have had those for many years. But the picture you get is of constantly trying to just avoid catastrophe. Is that what it was like inside that pinball machine? Well,
damage control is always important, particularly in national security, where so many things happen in so many different ways with no advance warning. I think that there were obviously successes that occurred during my tenure. I think getting out of the Iran nuclear deal was a significant success. I think getting out of the INF treaty with Russia was a significant success. But because of the president's substance-free actions in the case of dealing with North Korea or Iran or China or Russia or Turkey, things could go up and down in a given day to the point where it was hard to maintain consistency. And I think that's not just bad for the future of American national security alone, it's bad for relationships with allies who came to wonder when they could ever count on persistence in pursuing a policy and consistency in our alliances. Which is not to say they're entirely free from causing their own problems. I'm not making excuses for the allies. I'm trying to say that the best way to guarantee American security through the structure of alliances we have is to lead and lead in a consistent fashion.
Despite the best efforts of officials like yourself, do you think Donald Trump has made the world a more dangerous place for Americans?
Well, I think there are some aspects where he has made America safer. I think the increase in defense budgets in the first term has been extremely significant. And I think there's every prospect in a second term he will cut those budgets because he knows that the core of the Republican Party supports a very strong defense establishment, that deterrence and peace through strength are more than slogans. They reflect how you deal with reality. But I think in a second term you can be almost certain that he will cut defense budgets so he can spend more on infrastructure and other things like that. The uncertainty and the risks we face around the world during his first term, though, have been growing significantly. And I think you can see that reflected across the issues that I discuss in the book. Most recently, just as an example, in the case of North Korea, the North Koreans have blown up the liaison offices that they had built north of the demilitarized zone to deal with South Korea. So you can say, well, okay, so 2 years were wasted. He tried. We didn't lose anything. I'll tell you what we lost. We lost 2 years. In the fight against proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, time's always on the side of the proliferator. And during the 2 years of these photo opportunities and playing around with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean ballistic missile and nuclear programs proceeded apace. So we're 2 years closer to the North Koreans having a capability to hit targets in the United States. You can go down the long list with respect to China, for example. He was so focused on a big trade deal with China that he excused all kinds of other Chinese behavior. Now, in light of the coronavirus, he's gotten very tough on China. And I think that will last right up until November the 3rd. And then on November the 4th, if he wins, I think it's only a matter of time before he calls Xi Jinping and he says, let's talk about that trade deal.
So you have impeccable Republican credentials. Are you going to vote for Trump in November?
I'm not going to vote for Trump. Don't get me wrong, I'm not going to vote for Biden either. I think a number of Republicans who turned against Trump are going to vote for Biden. That's obviously their decision. But I think it's critical the day after the election, whether Trump wins or loses, that the battle for the soul of the Republican Party begins. And certainly in the national security field, I think it's very important that the party come to the view that we need to correct the mistakes that the Trump administration made. Because the Democratic Party at this point does not really have a strong national security wing. There is no Scoop Jackson wing of the Democratic Party anymore. There's not even a Joe Lieberman wing of the Democratic Party anymore. So this is incredibly important as the baby boomers leave the scene and other generations come in who don't remember what a nuclear weapon can do. I think for too many Americans, nuclear weapons are things they see in grainy 1940s, 1950s pictures. They don't realize how dangerous the world is out there. And the collapse of communism and the disintegration of the Soviet Union obviously gave birth to an enormous false sense of security. In a way, the world, as Gene Kirkpatrick predicted, has returned to normal, which is great power competition. but added in the threat of radical Islamicist terrorism and a range of threats from would-be nuclear weapon states. So the world is becoming more disorderly, and it becomes more disorderly in large part when the United States recedes. And that's what Trump did. Obama was doing many of the same things. And one of the attractions to me of trying to get into what I hoped would be a Republican administration that would sail down the mainstream of Republican foreign policy was correcting those mistakes from the Obama years.
So you're not going to vote for Trump, you're not going to vote for Biden. Who are you going to vote for?
I'm going to write in the name of a conservative Republican yet to be determined. I honestly think that the most important priority this November for Republicans needs to be keeping control of the Senate. And while I don't think the presidential election is a foregone conclusion by any stretch of the imagination, I think it's a coin toss at this point. I'm very much afraid that the effect of Trump on the electorate, even if he wins, even if he gets 270 electoral votes, may be negative enough to sink enough Republican Senate candidates that we lose control of the Senate. So if I can get past the book launch and get back to focusing on electoral politics for part of my time, I want to do whatever I can to maintain Republican control of the Senate.
If Republicans lose control of the Senate in November, will that be because of Trump?
I think it's entirely possible. The way Trump won election in 2016 and the way he could well win re-election in 2020 was winning, as the Constitution provides, more than 270 electoral votes. But his popular vote totals in the country as a whole and in many of the hotly contested states could be at a level where it has a negative effect on Republican Senate candidates. It's a very different calculus for these candidates. Do they support him strongly? Do they try and distance themselves from him? And I think that if they're not careful, they could go, even if Trump got support, enough support for him to be reelected.
You're not going to vote for Trump, you're not going to vote for Biden. But thinking about the bet, and you're going to write in a conservative to be determined who probably is not going to win.
Yeah, my plan is to hope for a miracle.
For the good of the country and the good of the party you have so long served, are those interests better served by a Biden victory so that you can move into the post-Trump era?
I don't think so. In 2016, having heard in advance what a Trump presidency would look like, I still thought it was worth the risk to vote for Trump against Hillary Clinton. And I did. I voted for Trump in 2016, and that's why I went on to serve in the administration. I thought we could make it right. And I've concluded, and that's basically what is laid out, one fact after another in the book, is why that was wrong. So I do not accept that you have to vote for one candidate or the other. That was not the position I held in 2016. I've changed my mind. But I don't think that at this point you can say with confidence what the Democratic Party is going to be, whether it's the old moderate, I mean, using the word moderate now in a way nobody does, nobody would have imagined 25 or 30 years ago, or whether the more radical left-wing elements take over. It's an election with no good choices from my perspective.
You've now seen President Trump up close in the most private of consultations. Do you think there is any possibility that he will try to delay or dispute the November election?
I don't. I haven't seen any indication that he's thinking that. But you'll recall in the 2016 debates before the Republican nomination, he would not agree he would not agree to accept the results. Now, ironically, of course, it was Hillary Clinton who didn't accept the results quickly. It's different, I think, when you're sitting in the White House. I hope it is. And I think at that point, if the overwhelming, indeed 100% minus one person of the adherents of the Republican Party don't tell him, you've lost, get out, then we would be in serious trouble. But I don't think there's any chance of that happening. I think that one of the mistakes the Democrats made in the impeachment was making no effort to reach out on the Republican side. I think it doomed their efforts to failure. The reason Richard Nixon was forced from office was when Republicans went and said, time is up. And I feel, as much as I can feel certain about anything, that would happen even after a close election.
Impeachment. You write you have such an interesting perspective on impeachment. You accuse Democrats of impeachment malpractice, which is a wonderful phrase, because they kept the focus narrowly on Ukraine, because they hurried it along, because they wanted to get it out of the way before the election year. To first talk about Ukraine, though, you declined to testify. Democrats have been very critical of that. If you had testified, either because House Democrats got you to testify or because the Senate Republicans agreed to subpoena you in the trial, would the outcome have been different?
I don't think it would have been different at all because of the way the House advocates of impeachment structured their campaign. And if you go back to September of 2019, I resigned on September the 10th. The whistleblower, I think, came out the next day. Although the fact of the whistleblower's complaint had existed, I didn't know about it at the time I resigned. Trump released the Ukraine money on September the 11th. The whistleblower emerged. Things started exploding, and almost overnight, the Democrats were on the way to impeachment because of Ukraine. What I was doing, honestly, was leaving the government, putting my life back together. And they fixed on a strategy which I think was based on the failure of the Russia collusion model. They saw Ukraine as a quick and dirty way to get a majority for impeachment in the House of Representatives based on evidence they thought sufficient but not overwhelming at all. And that they didn't look at any of the potential issues beyond Ukraine. What that did, and I think this is perfectly visible in the hearings of the Intelligence and Judiciary Committees, was they drove Republicans into their corner. And even Republicans who might have been sympathetic to trying to hear and understand the full context of Ukraine and then possibly other issues were in a defensive crouch. It guaranteed that the vote on the House floor on the articles of impeachment would be essentially party line, and that in turn guaranteed that the vote in the Senate was going to be on party lines. So that at some point, people tuned out to anything else. And I think whatever I had to say in January would have gotten lost in the shuffle. I don't agree with the notion that the only legitimate constitutional strategy to deal with Donald Trump was in the minds of the House Democratic leadership. We're all entitled to come up with our own strategy. And my view was that given their malpractice in the handling of impeachment, the institution to put our faith in is the American people. And so it may not take a village, but it does take a book to put together all of these points for people to consider. And there'll be debate over them and so on and so forth. That's fine. All I ask is that people look at these facts and decide whether they are meaningful. And that, I think, is one of the virtues. If the House had taken its time and impeachment hearings continued and were going on even today, that would be an entirely good thing for the country. The Irvin Committee in Watergate days proceeded in a bipartisan fashion. It took a long time. The process of impeachment went on nearly 2 years and before it finally succeeded. The Democrats weren't hearing any of that. It was a big, big mistake on their part.
Do you think, if you had been in the U.S. Senate, would you have thought that the Ukraine matter was an impeachable offense, that you would have voted to convict Donald Trump on that issue?
Well, I think I probably would have, although honestly, we still don't know everything there is to know about Ukraine. And a lot of conduct can be reprehensible without being impeachable. And I could certainly understand people who took that point of view. A number of Republicans did. But the issue is making sure that presidents don't take the power of the government and abuse it for their own personal interest, whether it's their own political interest or economic interest or what have you. And I think that's very much the concern that I had looking at the pattern of conduct that Donald Trump exhibited across a number of fronts that I discuss in the book, that had there been an impeachment process that took the time to say, look, let's look into these areas. Let's not get into a fight with Republicans immediately. Let's see if there's any common ground, and not torque ourselves around the Democratic presidential nomination schedule. I mean, I know that was inconvenient for the Democrats, but we're talking about the power of impeachment, which is probably the House of Representatives' gravest constitutional responsibility. Isn't that worth taking time?
When I was walking out of my house this morning, my husband said, you know, I don't think Bolton's testimony would have mattered in impeachment, but it may matter in the election. So in terms of affecting Donald Trump's tenure in office, this is a more influential way to go. Do you think that's true?
Yes, I think that is correct. You know, the impeachment mechanism is the guardrail in the Constitution that's supposed to be used only in extreme circumstances. The real guardrail in the Constitution is elections, seeing what the people actually believe, and I think that could well prove itself out here.
If your book, which has already gotten it's not published yet and it's gotten enormous amounts of attention, if your book contributes to the defeat of Donald Trump in November, is that okay with you?
I have tried to advance my philosophy during my entire political career, and I don't consider one person to embody that philosophy. It's certainly not Donald Trump, but one of the lessons I learned from my first job in the government in Washington, when I was a White House summer intern, before that became a well-known position, as I worked for Spiro Agnew, I was from Baltimore, Maryland. Agnew was my governor. I thought he was a very gracious man, a strong supporter of his, until after my internship ended and I found out what he did on the side. And that to me was a strong lesson in not putting your faith in one person. Ultimately, it's the philosophy that counts. I'm not looking forward to 4 years of a Biden administration and some of the advisors he may have around him, which is why I think emphasis on keeping the Senate is so important. But I think if you look at the long-term interest of national security in the United States, we cannot leave it in Donald Trump's hands.
Amazing stories about President Trump's behavior with other leaders, including leaders who are our adversaries, not our allies. This amazing story about his comments to Xi of China about helping him out in the election, in his re-election bid. Is that an impeachable offense?
Well, I think it goes to the question of fitness for office. And, you know, it should not be a binary choice that the only way you get rid of an unfit president is through impeachment. That's not what the framers intended. And why that has to be the kind of sine qua non that if you don't favor impeachment, somehow you're morally bankrupt. The issue is whether you have trust in the people ultimately. And I think for the good of the country, the dangers of the impeachment process argue for prudence before invoking it. And let's ask, what is the outcome of the effort to impeach Donald Trump? You know, some people said, well, he's impeached forever. Yes, he's also acquitted forever. So by going through that process, do you constrain his future behavior or do you enable it? I think it's beyond dispute that Trump has been enabled by this, which means the last resort is what happens this November.
You were concerned enough to go talk to the Attorney General. What did he tell you? What was his response?
Well, he didn't give. He was in the listening mode. I think that's fair to say, and I understood that. I said the same thing to White House counsel Cipollone. And what I was trying to do was avoid doing other people's jobs for them. I gave them the information, and I counted on them to do what they were responsible to do.
Do you think Attorney General Barr is doing a good job as Attorney General?
Well, since he's litigating against me at the moment, it's probably better that I not get into that. But this is a circumstance where people should look at the president's behavior and consider what it means when he intervenes in individual legal cases on whatever side he might choose to. Because the rule of law, I think, has to be even-handed. And when it's not even-handed, I think it delegitimizes our law enforcement institutions, which are under particular strain already at the moment.
Just another senior administration official, Mike Pompeo, not happy with you this morning. Did note that you say he gave you in that meeting. Did you keep it?
No, I think he wrote it on his. We had pads in front of us. I think he wrote it on his pad and showed it to me, and I nodded my head, and he took it back. I think that's what happened.
Yeah. Have you heard from any of these people since the contents of the book came out?
Well, I don't want to play "Is it bigger than a bread box" with you, so I'll respectfully duck that question.
Okay, all right. I'll take that as a yes. Why do you think the Justice Department filed these suits against you for the book?
I think because of the president's insistence. Don McGahn, who was the first counsel to the president in the Trump administration, used to refer to the president as King Kong. and I think you're getting that reaction. As we've explained, Chuck Cooper, my attorney, had a great op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a few days back explaining the clearance process we went through. I didn't write a manuscript that had any classified material in it, in my view. It was never my intention to disclose classified information. I had plenty to write about without doing that. I didn't really feel I had to submit the book for pre-publication review for that reason. But I did, out of an abundance of caution. We went through an arduous 4-month process, and the government itself, in its complaint, agrees that there was no more classified information in the manuscript. And then they went back to do a second review. And I think what that is about is the president, having said publicly, having addressed the anchors of all the major networks, saying, I don't want that book out before the election.
What worries him about your book?
The truth.
And they've pursued these legal actions with no real expectation of succeeding, right? I mean,
Well, I think they want to try and stretch out whatever they can. I think the main thing that the president wants to avoid is the book coming out before the election. This has nothing to do with classified information. It's the revelation about the president himself that bothers them. He's not worried about foreign governments reading this book. He's worried about the American people reading this book.
That ship has sailed.
Well, we're in the middle of the litigation now, and we'll see how it comes out. But I think that prior restraints under the Constitution are clearly forbidden by the First Amendment, and only in the most extraordinary circumstances. Which this book is extraordinary for Donald Trump, but not for the national security of the United States.
I think very few people think the book isn't legal, but there are some people who think it is inappropriate, that it is inappropriate for a very senior official to write such damaging things about a sitting president. Pretty rare. How do you respond to those critics?
Well, first, it's not rare at all. Bob Gates wrote a book about his time as Secretary of Defense, published during the Obama administration. He was criticized for writing about Hillary Clinton in the middle of her presidential campaign. The fact is, as long as history is a continuous stream, books like this are always inconvenient for somebody. And the real issue, in my view, and I wrote about this in 2014 when I wrote a book review of Gates's book, and I put a long quotation from this book review in my book, is that senior government officials, I believe, have an obligation to the American people to tell what it's like behind the scenes, because with all due respect to the news profession, you just get glimpses and bits and pieces of it. The people should see how their government works. Transparency is not a bad thing. And the idea that there's an omerta code of silence in politics has never really existed. I point out that in George Washington's administration, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton were going at each other tooth and toenail. They even had competing newspapers funded in part by federal government money. And somehow, poor George Washington muddled through. So we have controversy in American politics. We're not going to get away from it. And this is something, again, the ultimate judgment here is for the people. And I'm content to let them read it, and they'll make up their mind.
Some Democrats make an opposite argument about the book, which was not that it's inappropriate to tell this behind the scenes picture, but that you should have done it faster, that you should have done it as soon as you were out of government. When the impeachment process was going on, Adam Schiff tweeted yesterday, Bolton saved it for a book. He may be an author, but he's no patriot. Do they have any point?
No, I don't think so. I think, look, Adam Schiff is one of those responsible for the catastrophic failure of the impeachment effort. So, of course, he's upset by what he's now learning. But you could not give testimony of the kind that this book contains. And if anybody believes you can, go back and watch the hearings again and see what they were like. The issue here is how you bring these facts to the attention of the American people. And Schiff had his view, and he proved wrong. He failed. I think the measure of success or failure of my book is how many people consider the facts in it. And they will make up their reaction. A lot of Republicans, for example, I think will read this book and vote for Trump anyway. And that's certainly their decision. I just want them to know what they're voting for.
Actually, I think one thing that will surprise some readers is the substance of the book. You know, the long discussion of policy. It's not just all, I mean, it's that's sort of an aside. That's not a question, but I think that's true. It's really a very substantive book. President Trump
Can I make a point on that?
Yes, of course.
The reason the book is substantive is it's important to give it in the historical context. I think a lot of books about the president written by journalists, again, you'll forgive me, are that they think everything is personalities, and it's all what is the element of scandal here, and what is the unflattering portrayal of this person. My objective for history is to show how close policy came to near disastrous outcomes because the president didn't address American national security issues in a sustained, coherent fashion. That is the main point. So the substance, some people may say, what's all this substance doing in here? I don't want to read about the INF Treaty or cyber warfare or anything like that. But that's the real key here. Is the administration keeping America safe?
Is the administration keeping America safe?
No, I'm very worried about this. In the post-Cold War environment, many people believe that the victory over communism meant that we were in the broad sunlit uplands. We didn't have any more threats to worry about. In fact, the exact opposite is true. This is what it means to say we're now in normal times. We face strategic threats from Russia and China. We face immediate threats from terrorists, from proliferators of weapons of mass destruction, from a whole range of other potential adversaries and difficulties. So actually, unlike Cold War days, the range of threats that we face, the number of contingencies, both political and military and economic, that we have to deal with are greater than during the Cold War. So what that means is, in terms of presidential leadership, you need more sustained, more comprehensive thinking, not less. And that's what worries me about Trump. He doesn't focus on these issues in a systematic way. And even when he does focus on a country like China, and does demonstrate, I think, some understanding of the connection between economic strength and military and political strength, the only issue that really engages him is trade. He wants that big trade deal, and everything else is secondary. That's a big problem.
The criticism you make of journalists is one that you also make of Trump, though, that you see everything as a celebrity in terms of personalities and a matter of celebrity, not a matter of policy or the bigger context of things. But you've met with many foreign leaders over the years, including with President Trump during your time in service. Tell me what you think, briefly, a couple of them, what they think of Trump. What does, for instance, Putin think of Trump?
I don't think he believes Trump is serious. And I think that provides opportunities. I would say this with respect to all of them, really, not just Vladimir Putin, provides them opportunities, which is why they're so eager to meet with him one-on-one. But it also means that it's hard for anybody else to carry on substantive discussions, because there's always a question whether the particular individual, even somebody who's thought to be close to the president, will necessarily be representing the view he has, not on the day they're talking, but on the next day. And it's the uncertainty, volatility, scattershot approach to decision making that, whatever the substantive outcome, I think leaves America more vulnerable. And so what that says to foreign leaders is you can hardly count on anything here. And it tends to drive them away from the United States, because they can't see with certainty how we will really react. Now, I think this is repairable. After one term of Trump, I'm not sure Joe Biden is the person to repair it, but I don't think we're on an unchangeable slide into second-class status. I think it would be worse after a second Trump term. But it goes to the question that we just have to have a philosophical debate within the Republican Party and get ourselves back on track. And the country itself has work that will have to be done as the threats from Russia and China have continued and expanded, as the threats of proliferation have continued, and as the threats of terrorism, as we see in Afghanistan, for example, have not diminished.
One of the things that continues to perplex me is President Trump's longstanding attitude toward Russia. Back from the campaign, the platform process at the convention, his actions as president. What accounts for that attitude, do you think?
Well, I think part of it is, at least I can speak to the time in the White House, is that the Russia collusion allegation raised against him made it very hard for him to admit that there was Russian interference in the election at all, because if he had admitted it, it would have given rise to the implication that his election was illegitimate. Now, I don't think there's evidence that the Russian involvement had an impact on the election itself one way or the other. But I also don't think there's any doubt the Russians have been trying to cause mischief, as has China and have Iran and North Korea and others. The mischief they want to cause is to reduce our faith in our own institutions, to get us going at each other's throats. If that's their objective, and I think it is, they're doing a pretty good job. And it's really very frightening. So I describe in the book, in a chapter called Thwarting Russia, what we did in cyberspace to give us new capabilities, to prevent what I said before I joined the administration was an act of war against the United States for trying to interfere in our elections.
Do you think there's some more fundamental personal reason, some financial reason or other reason for the president's attitude toward Russia?
I don't know of any. I think it's not even an attitude toward Russia. I think it's an attitude toward Vladimir Putin,
Yeah.
and it's of a piece with his view of other leaders. You know, I think he likes to be a big guy.
Yeah.
He sits down with other big guys, and the two of them work it out. This is there's an important personal element in international relations between the leaders of countries, but Putin and Xi Jinping both said to him very clearly, look, you represent American interest, we represent our interest. They understand that. I'm not sure Donald Trump does.
What do you think Xi thinks of Trump?
I think much the same as Putin. I think he sees that he can take advantage of him, and they're happy to have the negotiations directly with Trump. Now, China is so bureaucratic that it doesn't normally work out that way. But I think that they see his fascination with the deal, this desire to have a deal almost without regard to what the terms are, and the idea that if they can purchase more agricultural products, that'll bring the deficit down and that'll make Trump happy, seems to them an easy thing to do. We don't really have a clear deal with China now. The basic structural issues and the way they manipulate the World Trade Organization and the international economic order remain unaddressed. But I think despite the hostility that the president's showing toward China now because of the virus, if he wins re-election, they'll be back talking about the big trade deal.
I want to talk about President Trump's year. This has been a tough year for President Trump in a couple ways. First, in his handling of the coronavirus. You write some about handling pandemics in your book, although, of course, the COVID-19 didn't erupt until after you left. You say, the NSC biosecurity team functioned exactly as it was supposed to. It was the chair behind the Resolute desk that was empty. Tell us about how you think Trump has handled this crisis for America.
Well, I think he's handled it very badly, and it's not to say that every decision has been wrong. I think this is a mistake Trump critics make, and it's the reverse is the mistake Trump supporters make. Everything he does is right or everything he does is wrong is not accurate, and I think it clouds the debate and makes it hard to have rational discourse. But in the beginning, in January, when media had later reported the directors at the NSC responsible for looking for this sort of thing and others in the government were saying this pandemic is bad news and we've got to get ready for it. They were saying that in early January. And yet the White House not only didn't do anything, the president was saying the exact opposite. That's why there was an empty chair in the Oval Office. Why was he saying there's nothing to worry about? I think two reasons. Number one, he didn't want to hear anything bad about China. He didn't want to hear anything bad about Xi Jinping, his buddy. He didn't want to hear anything bad that would affect Chinese economic performance that might prevent them from making the big trade deal or honoring their commitments to buy American agricultural products. He didn't want to hear anything that would disrupt his quest for the big deal. That's number one. And number two, he didn't want to hear anything bad about the American economy. He didn't want to hear that we've got a big problem here that could not only affect China epidemiologically and economically, but could do the same in the United States, because his ticket to re-election he has seen, not without justification, as a strong U.S. economy. So that holding your hands over your ears, which is what he was doing for the first several months, and he and several senior members of the administration went out and said it's under control, it's not spreading, it's going to magically disappear. People have made up long lists of those things. Reflect that although the institutions of government were saying, sending up flares and red flags and saying this is getting more and more serious, the person in the Oval Office did not want to hear it.
Let's talk about the other crisis he's faced, the Black Lives Matter protest. A lot of that a little outside of your purview, but we have seen this split develop between the president and our top military leaders in the wake of that Lafayette Square photo op, both the defense secretary and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs kind of apologizing for participating in that. Does this concern you? Is this something the Americans should worry about?
Well, I think that is an example of the larger point that I try and demonstrate in the book, which is that everything in the administration is at risk of being torqued around Donald Trump's personal needs. He wanted that photo op holding up the Bible in front of St. John's Church. I think it could turn out to be a classic mistake to have done that. But Secretary Esper, General Milley, and others who ended up marching over there were put in an incredibly awkward position. And I don't envy them the fact that they had to go through that. That's not what a president should do. If he wants the photo op, he doesn't have to take an army with him, an army of people, his entourage. This is not a European-style government. If the president wants a photo op, stand there by yourself. This happens over and over again. This fusing of legitimate government interest and Donald Trump's personal interest, and he just has enormous difficulty separating the two. So I think that the handling of the current situation has reflected that. This has been about his reelection. What looks good for his reelection? So when General Mattis, with whom I had a dispute or two during our time together, talked about the president dividing the country, I think that's a view that many, many people hold, that it's not simply about Donald Trump's reelection. Or I could just make the very practical political argument that if he acted like a leader of all the people, heaven forbid, it might actually enhance his chances of being reelected.
Would you have walked over across the square with him that night?
You know, I have to say, in all honesty, I probably would have. And I would have regretted it later. That's part of the problem of being in the Trump administration. That's why I went through a lot of thinking, pro and con, before I resigned. I know others who are also alumni of the Trump administration went through that same sort of thinking, and people who are in it now are trying to balance what is the right thing to do. So I don't really want to second guess anybody. This is a very hard calculation to make.
Hard place to be in. Is there like a club of former Trump aides? Have you formed like a support group of some sort?
No, but you know, we might need a stadium to do it. It's
I mean, it seems like there's a consistent, even if people with whom you battled inside, there's sort of a consistent story once you're out.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think the historians are going to have to look at the number of people who cycled through. And if there's a second term, I mean, the numbers really, you will need a football stadium to hold it in. It's not good for the management of the country. It's not good for the management of government when you lose continuity, when the president doesn't have enough faith in his own personnel decisions to see them through times when there might be disagreements. I mean, it is part of his management style, which has made it very difficult for a lot of people, is that he disparages his advisors one to another. And I recount some stories of that in the book.
Well, I've got one note here that we haven't gotten to. Ivanka and Jared.
Well, I really don't want to get into discussing the family. I talk about specific cases in the book, mostly about Jared because of his the role that the president gave him in a number of circumstances. But the actor here, the decision maker, is the president. And he's the one responsible for, I think, making the mistake of having his family too much involved in government. I could make the same criticism of Bill Clinton, giving Hillary Clinton responsibility for health care reform, which crashed and burned. You can't fire your wife in that circumstance. I think the anti-nepotism rules, while originally designed to prevent favoritism within families, actually have a meaning that maybe originally wasn't perceived, but that it's just better not to have your family involved. We're not above the family store here. And for the sake of the government itself, there are lessons to be learned.
Well, Ambassador, thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
No, thank you for coming by.